Across studios and stages, thousands have watched as ordinary broadcasts turned into tragedies. From anchors collapsing mid-report to performers caught in deadly stunts, these moments remind us how fragile live television can be, and how quickly the line between routine and disaster disappears. It was February 18th, 2016, in Wichita, Kansas. Inside a small local TV studio, morning anchor Laura Kinney started her usual early shift. The set lights were bright, the crew small, and everything followed its normal routine. Laura had worked in radio before joining television 5 years earlier. Viewers liked her for being steady and clear, especially during local emergencies or storm reports. That morning, she arrived earlier than usual, sipping coffee and rubbing her neck. She mentioned it felt stiff, joking that she must have slept wrong. A few co-workers noticed her voice sounded slightly off, but they thought she was just tired. The broadcast began at 6 a.m. sharp. Laura sat beside her co-anchor, ready for the local weather segment. Everything looked normal to viewers. The calm tone, the light banter, the switch between graphics. In the control room, producers kept the teleprompter rolling as the floor crew adjusted the camera angles. It was just another weekday show, with segments about community events and mild winter temperatures. Halfway through a sentence, something changed. Laura's left hand slipped off the desk, knocking cue cards onto the floor. For a moment, she stayed frozen, eyes still open but unfocused. Her smile faltered, and her voice cut off mid-word. On screen, it looked like she paused to listen to someone in her earpiece. Her co-anchor turned to her, unsure whether it was a planned pause or a mistake. Then Laura's head tilted to one side, and she slumped slightly forward in her chair. The control room reacted fast. A director called to switch cameras, cutting to a weather graphic to cover the feed. The co-anchor leaned toward her, whispering something the microphones didn't catch. Someone off-camera shouted her name. The station had a short broadcast delay of a few seconds, just enough to stop most of what happened from airing on TV. But the live stream running on the network's website didn't cut fast enough. Viewers online saw about 10 seconds of confusion. Laura collapsing, papers sliding, crew members stepping into frame before the screen switched to an ad break. Inside the studio, floor staff rushed forward. One producer hit the master mute button as the commercial loop started playing. When the cameras were cut, the floor manager dimmed the lights to reduce glare while the crew gathered around her desk. A staff member moved her chair back, while another called out for the set to be cleared. No one outside the studio knew what was happening yet. Regular viewers simply assumed it was a technical fault. Within an hour, the station's programming went silent. The screen showed a plain blue background with a notice about technical issues. Social media users began asking what had gone wrong when the live stream froze mid-report. Short clips from the feed briefly appeared online before being removed by moderators. Those who saw it described the moment as sudden and unsettling, with only the low hum of background studio noise. By midday, all live segments were canceled, and staff were advised not to comment publicly. Viewers who called the station reached a recorded message explaining that the morning broadcast had been interrupted due to an on-air emergency. For 2 days, the newsroom stayed quiet. Regular programming resumed the following Monday with a different anchor at the desk and a brief note thanking viewers for their understanding. The studio lights came back on, the music cues played, and the set looked exactly the same. For the staff who had been there that morning, the room stayed unusually quiet for the rest of the week. It was September 14th, 2018, in Legazpi City, Albay. A typhoon had made landfall before noon, bringing winds strong enough to shake street signs and bend power lines. Rain came in sheets, hitting the pavement sideways. Local news crews had been deployed across the region to report live updates. Among the crews sent out that morning was 34-year-old Miguel de la Peña, a relatively new field correspondent assigned to cover weather updates outside the main city. He had joined the network less than 2 years earlier, after working behind the scenes as a production assistant. Storm coverage wasn't new to him, but this was one of the few times he was leading a live field report. Producers described him as steady on camera and willing to take difficult assignments, even in poor weather. That morning, he and his cameraman set up near a closed pier along the coast. The sky was a flat gray, visibility down to less than a few hundred feet. Seawater sprayed over the concrete barriers as waves struck the shore. Miguel wore a blue rain jacket, hood tightened, microphone wrapped in plastic. Behind him, a few residents stood under awnings, watching from a safe distance. He spoke steadily, updating wind speed readings and evacuation numbers, while the cameraman kept the lens steady despite the gusts. Their early segments aired without issue. Each one lasted less than a minute before switching back to the studio anchor. Between takes, Miguel and the cameraman took cover behind a parked van to shield their equipment from the wind. They checked their earpieces for sound clarity, and Miguel ended each report with a short reminder for viewers to remain indoors. By late morning, the wind picked up again. The next segment was meant to show how conditions had worsened along the pier. Miguel stood several feet in front of the camera, the storm roaring behind him. Pieces of trash, small branches, and plastic containers blew across the ground. He began describing the intensity of the wind when something shifted in the background. A warehouse roof panel near the shore started to lift. The sheet of corrugated metal, about 10 feet long, came loose from its bolts and turned end over end in the air. On the live feed, viewers saw Miguel glance upward mid-sentence. His words stopped, replaced by the howl of wind against the microphone. The camera tilted slightly as the cameraman reacted, trying to follow his movement. In the corner of the frame, a gray blur streaked across. The feed shook violently for half a second before cutting to static. People watching at home thought it was just another connection drop, common during storms, but those taking shelter near the pier saw it happen. A market vendor crouching beside a delivery truck later said the noise began with a deep rumble, followed by the heavy crash of metal striking concrete. The cameraman was knocked down by wind but managed to crawl behind the van, shielding the camera under his body. The network's broadcast continued from the studio, unaware of what had happened at the pier. Producers tried to reach the field team for several minutes before switching to pre-recorded updates from other regions. By early afternoon, all outdoor coverage was replaced with studio segments. A short announcement noted connection problems affecting reporters near the coast. Later that day, local authorities blocked access to the pier to remove loose metal sheets and scattered debris. The network later issued a short notice online, pausing live field reporting until conditions improved. It was October 3, 2015, in Manchester, England. A local charity event brought together small-time performers, singers, and illusionists for a weekend recording inside a modest studio. One of the acts scheduled that afternoon was Ryan Mallory, 29, a street magician who had started appearing on minor regional programs. He was known for small escape demonstrations at fairs and public gatherings. The segment he planned to film was called Escape from the Tank, a timed underwater act meant to close the second half of the show. The tank stood at the center of the stage, made of clear acrylic panels and about 6 feet tall. Metal brackets held it in place under bright studio lights. The plan was simple. Ryan would be handcuffed, submerged, and then escape within 60 seconds while the studio audience watched the timer on a digital clock. Although the show was promoted as a live special, most of the performances were pre-recorded earlier in the day and edited for smoother transitions. For safety, rehearsals had used lightweight training locks and a quick-release chain. Before filming began, one crew member questioned whether the heavier stainless steel cuffs were necessary, but the decision was made to use them for visual impact. Crew members later recalled that Ryan seemed focused but restless, pacing near the tank while the host delivered his introduction. The production team filled the tank using a side hose, checking that the water reached just below the top rim. As assistants helped secure the cuffs around his wrists and ankles, the audience counted down from 5. Ryan climbed a small ladder and lowered himself into the water, holding a small key between his teeth, a familiar part of his routine. The lid was locked in place, and the clock started. At first, everything looked normal. The crowd could see his arms moving under the surface, the cuffs glinting under the lights. He twisted, shifting his shoulders, as he had done in past performances. Around the 30-second mark, his movements grew slower. The key slipped from his mouth and sank to the bottom of the tank. For a few seconds, no one reacted. It looked like a planned twist. Some audience members even laughed softly, expecting a quick recovery. Behind the curtain, 2 stagehands noticed the change in the water. Bubbles were rising in short, uneven bursts. One of them signaled to the stage manager that something was off. At 40 seconds, Ryan's motions became jerky, and he pressed one hand against the glass. The stage manager shouted for crew members assigned to handle safety to step in. None of them had dealt with a full water submersion act before. One assistant ran to pull the emergency release lever. The mechanism meant to lift the lid and drain the tank, but it jammed halfway. The camera feed captured the confusion. Crew members stepped into view as others tried to pry open the top with metal bars. Audience members began to stand, unsure if it was still part of the act. The sound in the room shifted from clapping to a mix of shouts and scraping metal. When the lid finally gave way, Water spilled across the stage floor. Ryan was pulled out by two assistants and laid on a flat surface beside the tank. For several seconds, the stage stayed quiet, except for someone calling for an ambulance. One assistant started basic CPR while others cleared space around the tank. During editing, producers cut the escape sequence and inserted a short placeholder card marked "Technical Delay." The program then continued with the next recorded act, leaving the studio audience and viewers unaware of what had taken place. Producers later chose to leave the segment out of the final program. The edited version of the charity special aired without any mention of the escape act. A few months afterward, a short rehearsal clip recorded during equipment testing surfaced in a small online forum for local performers. It showed Ryan practicing with the lighter cuffs and surfacing normally. It became the only version of the stunt seen outside the studio. It was November 9th, 2015, in Lyon, France. A regional civic hall had been converted into a small debate venue for a community television segment that would be recorded and broadcast later in the week. About 50 residents sat in folding chairs facing a low platform where 5 speakers discussed local housing policy. Cameras stood on tripods near the back, their red lights steady as the discussion began. The event was routine, part of a series of taped town hall discussions the city used for public outreach. One of the panelists was 61-year-old Jean-Marc Delcourt, a long-serving city council member known for his careful attention to budgets. The taping had started just after lunch, and the panel had already gone through several topics. The room was warm from the lights, and several speakers dabbed their faces with tissues between questions. Jean-Marc spoke clearly, gesturing often, pausing occasionally to check his notes. Technicians in the back monitored the sound levels while the host tried to keep the discussion within its time limits. About 20 minutes into the recording, tension increased as the speakers began to argue over rent control measures. Jean-Marc leaned forward to answer a pointed question from another guest. Mid-sentence, his voice caught. He straightened slightly, one hand braced on the table. For a few seconds, no one reacted. The other guests kept talking over him. Then his pen dropped to the floor. He pushed his chair back and tried to stand, but his movement faltered. The moderator stopped speaking and turned toward him, asking if he was all right. Jean-Marc's right arm dropped, and he slumped sideways. Chairs scraped against the floor as the nearest panelist reached out to steady him. A murmur passed through the audience. One of the camera operators called for the lights to be dimmed while crew members stepped forward. A staff medic and a volunteer from the municipal team rushed to the stage and lowered him gently to the ground. They began chest compressions, while another person used a handheld radio to call for emergency services. The cameras kept running for several seconds before someone shouted to cut power to the recorders. The host stood off to the side, holding a clipboard, as technicians guided the audience out through a side exit. Paramedics arrived within minutes and took over from the crew. The rest of the panel waited outside the hall, uncertain whether the taping would resume. The footage from the debate was never used. Editors replaced the planned segment with a short civic update and took the event listing off the local channel's schedule. A short notice posted later that week mentioned that filming had been stopped due to a medical emergency. The community program resumed the next month with a different panel and no reference to the incident. It was December 14, 2013, in São Paulo, Brazil. A small production team had been hired to record a Christmas-themed segment for a local children's program inside a shopping mall. The goal was to film short clips for the mall's holiday campaign, children meeting Santa, naming their wished-for gifts, and ending each take with a burst of confetti. The setup was simple: a red chair in the center, boxes wrapped in gold paper around it, and a low wooden platform hiding the small confetti rigs. 27-year-old João Ribeiro worked as a stage assistant. For this event, he wore the Santa costume and handled the prop triggers beneath the chair. The production crew had built the rig earlier that morning. It used small air pressure canisters to release paper confetti upward in short bursts. One technician had adjusted a canister after moisture caused a minor clog, but hadn't repeated the full pressure test because the next group of children was already waiting. By mid-afternoon, the filming had run smoothly through several rounds. Parents stood near the ropes taking photos while production staff guided children one by one to the chair. João pressed the release button after each take, letting the confetti fall while assistants swept up between groups. The final segment of the day was meant to feature a larger burst timed to music from a speaker behind the backdrop. As the next group approached, João reset the mechanism and signaled that he was ready. The director counted down. The children began their lines, reading from cue cards, while mall shoppers paused nearby to watch. When Jerome pressed the control for the confetti, the sound was wrong, more of a heavy pop than the usual short hiss. A moment later, the platform beneath the chair jolted upward. The pressure canister had ruptured instead of releasing air through the valve. The blast knocked Jerome backward into the stack of gift boxes. The lights flickered as smoke and fragments of shredded paper filled the air. Children closest to the set were pulled aside by parents, and staff shouted for everyone to move back. One technician hit the power switch for the stage lights, while another grabbed a fire extinguisher, unsure of what had failed. The mall's security team arrived within minutes and closed off the area with temporary barriers. Filming stopped immediately. Emergency responders later confirmed that Jerome sustained fatal injuries from the blast and was pronounced dead at the scene. The remaining equipment was disconnected and covered with tarps while authorities inspected the rig. No further announcements were made inside the mall. Shoppers only saw workers removing parts of the stage. That evening, the holiday display was replaced with a plain backdrop and a sign informing visitors that maintenance work was in progress on the seasonal installation. The production company quietly canceled the rest of the scheduled recordings. In the following weeks, the mall continued its Christmas program without stage props, using recorded music and a standard photo area instead. No footage from the earlier sessions was released, and the segment was never mentioned again in the show's schedule. It was December 22, 2013, in Yokohama, Japan. The plaza outside a large shopping mall had been turned into a parade route for the annual winter celebration. Every December, local businesses sponsored a short procession featuring holiday music, dancers, and themed floats meant to draw weekend crowds. The atmosphere was light, with parents holding phones above their heads and children clutching paper flags. A small community TV crew had been invited to film the event for a weekend program about local holiday activities. Their setup included 2 cameras on tripods and a handheld camcorder for close-up shots along the route. One of the performers that afternoon was Kenji Morita, 26, a part-time entertainer hired through an event staffing agency. He had been assigned to wear a reindeer mascot suit and ride the lead float, a small truck platform decorated with imitation snow and metallic ribbons. Kenji had done similar work before at mall promotions and school festivals. His role was to wave, toss soft snowballs to the crowd, and keep the energy light for the camera crew recording nearby. The morning had been busy. Setup crews ran cables for speakers, attached lights, and checked the floats. The truck Kenji stood on had a narrow front section lined with a light aluminum railing covered in tinsel. It wasn't meant for weight bearing, only decoration. One staff member had noticed that part of the front frame felt loose, but decided it was minor and tied it down with wire instead of rebolting it. The parade started slightly behind schedule after a sound test delayed the first lineup. By early afternoon, the plaza was full. Security volunteers guided the crowd to stay behind rope barriers, while children waved at passing performers. Kenji climbed onto his float, adjusting his heavy mascot head before taking position near the front corner. The costume restricted his vision, and the padded boots made footing unstable. When the signal to start came, the truck moved slowly along the marked path. The community TV crew followed along one side, capturing wide shots and cutaways for later editing. As the float turned near the central fountain, the driver steered gently, but hit a shallow incline that caused the platform to jolt slightly. Kenji, trying to steady himself, reached for the railing. The wire ties snapped from the tension, and the panel shifted forward. His right foot tangled in one of the speaker cables taped along the floor. He stumbled, unable to regain balance, and fell backward from the float onto the pavement behind the moving truck. The nearest camera operator caught the moment. The image wobbled as the lens followed the float, capturing Kenji's fall for less than a second before the operator realized something was wrong and turned away. For a few moments, the parade continued. Some spectators clapped, thinking the stumble was part of the performance, until one of the other mascots shouted toward the driver. The truck came to a stop, and the speakers kept playing the holiday music until a technician cut the sound. Security staff and parade volunteers moved quickly, forming a line to block the view while bystanders stepped back. A few people continued to film, unaware of the seriousness of the situation. Emergency responders arrived from a nearby fire station within minutes. Paramedics began first aid as the crowd was guided toward alternate exits. The remaining floats were directed to a holding area behind the mall, and the event was quietly suspended for the day. Despite immediate treatment, he was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at a nearby hospital. Afterward, the community TV team turned over their footage to mall management and removed the segment from their production schedule. Editors later reviewed the material and confirmed that only a few seconds showed the incident before the camera moved. The clip was stored in the archive, but never aired. The following week, the mall reopened the plaza with the decorations scaled back. The float route was shortened, and future parades were restricted to walking performers. A short local notice mentioned that the previous weekend's festivities had been paused because of an equipment-related accident. No further details were released. The community program aired a short holiday feature as planned, omitting any mention of the parade. It became an event remembered quietly, one that had once been cheerful but was not discussed again. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this video, click more.